Today we're examining a case that perfectly illustrates how financial demands can unravel years of carefully maintained deception. What started as a simple child support increase request became a legal battle that exposed fraud, destroyed reputations, and forced everyone involved to confront an uncomfortable truth. Here's David's story. I paid child support for 9 years without missing a single payment, and the one time I asked a question, my ex-wife called me a monster. For 9 years, I wired money every month like clockwork, showed up to birthday parties even when I wasn't welcome, picked Timmy up from school when she had other priorities, and never once complained about the system that left me broke while she lived comfortably in a house I helped fund. I wasn't father of the year, I'll admit that, but I was there, I was consistent, and I never made my son feel like a burden. Karen, my ex-wife, made sure everyone knew I was the bad guy in our divorce, the guy who gave up on their marriage, the guy who abandoned his family. But what she conveniently forgot to mention was the 3 affairs I discovered during our marriage, or the financial chaos she created behind my back, or the way she'd disappear for weekends and return smelling like someone else's cologne. I didn't fight her in court because I wanted Timmy to have stability. I didn't argue when she got primary custody because I believed a kid needed his mom. And I didn't push back when the judge set child support at a number that left me eating ramen 4 nights a week. I just paid, kept my head down, and tried to be the dad my son deserved, even though his mother made it clear I'd never be enough. Then last month, Karen's lawyer sent me a letter demanding an increase in child support. Not a small adjustment, but a 30% increase. And the reasoning was simple: inflation, rising costs, and the fact that my salary had grown since the divorce. I'm a financial manager. I work long hours. I've been promoted twice in the last 5 years. And yeah, I make more money now than I did when Timmy was a baby, but that doesn't mean I'm swimming in cash. I still live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I still drive a car with 160,000 miles on it. And I still budget every single dollar because half my paycheck disappears on the first of every month. Karen, on the other hand, hasn't held a steady job in 3 years, though she picks up part-time gigs when she needs quick cash. And she's constantly posting on social media about spa days and weekend getaways. Every time I pick up Timmy, he's wearing the same worn-out shoes while she's carrying a new handbag. The money I send doesn't seem to be going where it's supposed to. And when her lawyer started throwing around phrases about financial responsibility and the child's needs, I felt something inside me snap. I didn't hire a lawyer right away. I just asked for an audit, a simple breakdown of where the money was going, receipts for Timmy's expenses, proof that the increase was actually necessary, and you'd think I'd asked her to commit a crime. Karen blew up my phone with texts calling me controlling, accusing me of trying to punish her, saying I was weaponizing money to hurt our son. And when I didn't back down, she started posting vague messages on social media about deadbeat dads and men who abused the court system. I watched my phone light up with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, mutual friends who suddenly had strong opinions about my parenting, coworkers who saw her posts and asked if everything was okay at home, and I realized she was building a narrative where I was the villain and she was the victim. I wanted to scream. I wanted to post my own side of the story, but I didn't because I knew it would just make things worse, so I stayed quiet and let her control the conversation while I figured out my next move. Here's what I want you to think about. When someone gets this defensive over a simple request for transparency, what are they really protecting? Then we had a meeting, just the 2 of us, in a coffee shop near her apartment, and I brought a folder with 9 years of payment records, every bank statement, every receipt, every piece of proof that I'd never been late, never been negligent, never been anything but reliable. I slid the folder across the table and told her I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just wanted transparency, and she looked at me like I'd spit in her face. She didn't open the folder. She didn't even glance at it. She just stared at me with this cold expression and said I'd always been like this, always needing to be right, always needing to control everything. I felt my hands shake under the table because I wasn't angry yet. I was just exhausted, tired of being painted as the bad guy, tired of paying for a life I wasn't part of, tired of pretending that everything she did during our marriage didn't matter anymore. And that's when I said it, the thing I'd been holding back for almost a decade, the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the day I found out about her first affair. After everything you did during our marriage, after all the lies, I think I deserve to know the truth. I said, and she went completely still. I need a DNA test. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed like a bomb, and for a second, Karen just stared at me like I'd spoken a different language. Then she laughed, not a real laugh, but this sharp, bitter sound, and she asked if I was seriously going to punish our son because I couldn't let go of the past. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I just wanted to know, and she stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. She called me a monster, loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. And then she walked out, leaving me sitting there with my folder of useless receipts and a question I couldn't take back. I didn't hear from her for 3 days, and when she finally responded, it was through her lawyer, a formal letter saying she'd agree to the DNA test under the condition that I continued paying child support during the process and covered all associated costs. I agreed because I didn't have a choice, and because part of me, the part that had been there for every scraped knee and every bedtime story, believed the test would come back positive and this whole nightmare would be over. I scheduled the test at a clinic downtown. Karen brought Timmy in without saying a word to me, and I watched my son swab the inside of his cheek while his mother stood in the corner with her arms crossed, glaring at me like I was destroying his life. Timmy didn't understand what was happening. He just knew his dad was being weird, and when the nurse handed me my own swab, I felt like the worst person in the world. The results took 2 weeks, and during that time I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work, couldn't do anything except imagine the different ways this could go. I told myself it didn't matter what the test said, that I'd still be Timmy's dad, that biology wasn't everything. But deep down I knew that if the test came back negative, everything would change. I kept checking my email obsessively, refreshing the page every 10 minutes. And when the notification finally came through, I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. I opened the attachment on my phone, read the first line, and felt the entire world tilt sideways. 0% probability of paternity. I thought the test would shut the conversation down, maybe even force Karen to admit she'd been lying about the affairs, maybe prove that I wasn't just paranoid or controlling. I had no idea it would blow my entire life apart. This is a textbook example of how greed can trigger catastrophic consequences. Karen's demand for more money was the catalyst that exposed a lie she'd successfully maintained for nearly a decade. Sometimes the truth only emerges when someone gets too comfortable with their deception and pushes their luck too far. I stared at those words on my phone screen until they stopped making sense, 0% probability of paternity, and I kept rereading them like maybe I'd missed something. Like maybe there was fine print that would explain how 9 years of my life had been built on a lie. I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, watching people walk in and out of the grocery store with their carts full of normal Saturday night things. And I couldn't move because moving meant accepting what I'd just learned. The weird part is I didn't feel angry at first. I didn't want to scream or punch something or call Karen and lose my mind. I just felt stupid, like the biggest fool who ever lived, like everyone had known except me, and they'd all been laughing behind my back for almost a decade. I thought about every birthday party where I'd shown up with gifts, every school pickup where I'd rearranged my work schedule, every night I'd gone to bed exhausted because I'd spent my weekend being a dad, and none of it had been real, or at least not in the way I thought it was. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days because I didn't know how to say it out loud. I went to work and sat through meetings and answered emails and pretended everything was fine while my brain ran through every memory I had of Timmy as a baby, looking for signs I'd missed. I started seeing things that weren't there, or maybe they'd always been there and I'd just ignored them, like how Timmy had her eyes and her laugh, but nothing that looked like me. Or how during the pregnancy Karen had been strange about doctor's appointments, always going alone, always brushing off my questions. I called my brother on Wednesday night and told him everything, and he went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. And when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking and he asked what I was planning to do, and I realized I had no idea. Karen didn't reach out after the test, not a single text, not a call, nothing, and that told me everything I needed to know. She'd known, maybe not for certain, but she'd known it was possible. And she'd spent 9 years betting I'd never ask, that I'd just keep paying and keep playing dad and never question the story she'd sold me. On Friday, I got an email from her lawyer, not about the test results, but about the child support increase, like nothing had changed, like the DNA test was just a minor inconvenience we could move past. The email talked about setting aside our differences for Timmy's sake and hoping I'd do the right thing and continue supporting my son, and I almost threw my laptop across the room. I forwarded the email to a family lawyer I'd found online, a woman named Jennifer who had excellent reviews and a reputation for not backing down, and I scheduled a consultation for Monday morning. Jennifer looked at the DNA results for maybe 10 seconds before she looked up at me and laid out my options. I could petition to terminate child support immediately. I could sue for repayment of what I'd already paid, I could fight for custody if I wanted to maintain a relationship with Timmy despite the biology, or I could walk away completely. I told her I didn't want to hurt Timmy, that he didn't ask for any of this. And she nodded like she'd heard it 1,000 times before and explained that I needed to think about myself too, because Karen wasn't going to stop demanding money just because the truth was out. I signed the paperwork that day, a petition to terminate child support and a request for an emergency hearing, and Jennifer said she'd file everything by end of business. That's when Karen started her campaign, and I mean campaign, because what she did next was calculated and vicious and designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. She posted on every social media platform she had, long emotional posts about how I was abandoning a child I'd raised for 9 years, how I was using DNA as an excuse to escape my responsibilities, how I was traumatizing Timmy by rejecting him over something he couldn't control. She didn't mention the affairs. She didn't mention the lies. She just painted herself as a struggling single mom and me as a monster who decided biology mattered more than love. My phone exploded with messages. People I barely knew telling me I was disgusting, co-workers asking if the rumors were true, even my own mother calling to ask what I was thinking. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to post the DNA results and the affair timeline and every piece of evidence that showed who Karen really was. But Jennifer told me not to, that anything I said publicly could be used against me in court. So I just watched my reputation burn while Karen played the victim. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and in that time Karen did something I didn't expect. She named the biological father, a guy named Greg who'd worked with her at an insurance company back when Timmy was conceived, and she did it through her lawyer in a formal statement that basically threw him under the bus while trying to keep my wallet open. I'd never heard of Greg, didn't know what he looked like or if he even knew Timmy existed, but apparently Karen had kept in touch with him over the years, and now she was dragging him into this mess too. Jennifer called me and told me things just got more complicated because now there were 3 parties involved. Me trying to get out, Karen trying to keep the money flowing, and Greg who might not even know he had a kid. So here's a question for you. If you were Greg, and you just found out you potentially had a 9-year-old son you never knew about, what would you do? I looked Greg up on social media, found his profile in about 5 minutes, and spent an hour scrolling through photos of his life. He was married, had 2 kids of his own, worked as a sales manager, looked happy in that basic suburban dad way, and I wondered if he had any idea what was coming. Part of me wanted to message him, warn him, tell him that Karen was about to blow up his life the same way she'd blown up mine, but I didn't because Jennifer had made it clear I shouldn't contact anyone involved in the case. 2 days later, Greg's lawyer filed a motion demanding his own DNA test, which meant he either didn't know or didn't believe Karen. And suddenly there were 2 legal battles happening at once, me trying to get out and Greg trying to figure out if he was in. The worst part wasn't the court dates or the lawyers or even the money I was spending to untangle this nightmare. The worst part was Timmy. Karen had told him some version of the story, I don't know what exactly, but when I showed up for my next scheduled visitation, he looked at me different, like I was a stranger, like I'd done something wrong. He barely talked during the whole visit, just sat on my couch playing games on his tablet, and when I tried to explain that I still cared about him, that none of this was his fault, he just shrugged and said his mom told him I didn't want to be his dad anymore. I didn't know how to respond to that, didn't know how to tell a 9-year-old that his mom had lied about everything, so I just told him that wasn't true and left it at that. But I could see he didn't believe me. Jennifer filed the lawsuit the following week, not just against Karen, but a formal petition for fraud and repayment of child support, and she warned me it was going to get ugly. She said Karen would fight back, would use every trick in the book, would try to make me look like the villain, and she was right, because 2 days after the filing, Karen's lawyer submitted evidence that I'd allegedly known about her affair with Greg during the marriage and had accepted Timmy as mine anyway. The evidence was a series of text messages between me and Karen from years ago, messages where I'd said things about wanting us to work and believing Timmy needed both of us, and they were twisting my words to make it sound like I'd known all along and had waived my right to contest paternity. I read through those old messages and felt sick because they were real. I had said those things, but not because I knew Timmy wasn't mine. I'd said them because I was trying to save a marriage that was already dead. The hearing was scheduled for early November, 2 separate cases now running parallel. Mine against Karen and the state's case to establish Greg as the legal father. And Jennifer said, depending on how things went, this could drag on for months or even years. I asked her what my chances were, and she gave me this look that told me she'd seen cases like mine go both ways, explained that it really depended on the judge, that some saw this as fraud while others saw it as a man trying to escape responsibility, and that we needed to be prepared for anything. I went home that night and sat in my apartment staring at the wall, thinking about how I'd spent 9 years building a life that wasn't real, and how the only way forward was to tear it all down. Karen called me directly for the first time in weeks, using a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, she asked if I was really going to destroy everything. I told her she'd already done that, and she hung up. Notice how Karen's strategy shifted from denial to manipulation. When the DNA evidence became undeniable, she pivoted to weaponizing public opinion and using Timmy as emotional leverage. People who maintain long-term deceptions rarely admit fault. They simply adjust their tactics to protect themselves at any cost. The first hearing happened on a cold morning in early November, one of those days where the sky is gray and everything feels heavy. And I sat in that courtroom watching Karen's lawyer paint me as a man who'd raised a child for 9 years and was now abandoning him over a piece of paper. They had photos of me and Timmy at birthday parties, screenshots of text messages where I'd called him my son, even a Father's Day card he'd made me in 2nd grade, and they displayed it all like evidence of some kind of contract I'd signed in blood. Karen sat at her table looking devastated, dabbing her eyes with tissues, playing the part of the heartbroken mother protecting her child from a monster, and I wanted to stand up and scream that she'd lied about everything. But Jennifer squeezed my arm and whispered that I needed to stay calm. The judge, an older woman named Hayes who looked like she'd seen every trick in the book, listened to both sides without much expression, and when Karen's lawyer finished his performance about the importance of emotional bonds over biology, Judge Hayes asked one simple question that cut through all the noise. She asked if Karen had known or suspected during the marriage that the child might not be mine, and Karen's lawyer stumbled over his words trying to avoid a direct answer, talking about the complexities of relationships and the fog of memory, and I watched Judge Hayes' expression shift from neutral to skeptical in about 5 seconds. Jennifer stood up and presented the DNA results, the timeline of Karen's affair with Greg, and the fact that Karen had never once suggested a paternity test herself despite knowing about the affair, despite having every opportunity to come clean during the divorce proceedings 9 years ago. She brought up the child support modification request that had triggered this whole mess, pointed out that Karen had demanded more money while simultaneously hiding information that would have made me not legally responsible for any payments at all, and argued that this was textbook fraud. Karen's lawyer tried to redirect, claimed that I'd implicitly accepted paternity by being involved in Timmy's life, but Jennifer was ready with case law showing that fraud undermines everything, that you can't enforce a contract or obligation that was based on a lie. Judge Hayes called for a recess and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks, and as I walked out of that courtroom, Karen tried to approach me in the hallway, but her lawyer pulled her back and I just kept walking. I didn't hear anything for 10 days. And during that time, I lived in this weird limbo where I didn't know if I was still Timmy's father in the eyes of the law or if I was about to be released from a 9-year sentence I'd never deserved. I kept going to work, kept paying my bills, kept checking my email obsessively. And then on a Wednesday afternoon, Jennifer called and told me to sit down. Judge Hayes had ruled in my favor, terminated my child support obligation effective in 30 days pending any appeals, and ordered Karen to provide full financial documentation for a separate hearing about repayment of past support. Jennifer said it was a significant win, that judges rarely went this far in paternity fraud cases, but that the fight wasn't over because Karen could appeal and because the repayment case was going to be brutal. I asked what happened with Greg, and Jennifer said his DNA test had come back positive. He was Timmy's biological father, and the state was now pursuing him for future child support, while my case against Karen for repayment moved forward separately. That's when Karen made her biggest mistake, and I mean the kind of mistake that turns a legal case into a criminal investigation. About a month after the ruling, I got a notification from my bank about unusual activity on an old joint account I'd set up during our marriage for emergencies, one that was supposed to have been closed during the divorce, but had somehow slipped through the cracks. Someone had charged $8,000 to it over the course of 3 days. And when I called the bank, they told me the charges were for cash advances and transfers. I immediately thought of Karen, pulled up the account history online, and saw that she'd been using it sporadically for months, small charges here and there that I'd never noticed. But now she'd gone big, probably panicking about losing child support and thinking she could grab whatever she could before everything crashed down. I reported it to the bank, filed a fraud claim, and called Jennifer, who told me this was potentially identity theft and that I should file a police report immediately. I went down to the station and gave them everything, the account statements, the timeline, proof that I'd never authorized the charges, and the officer taking my report looked at me with this mix of pity and disbelief. Over the next month, the bank's fraud department confirmed that the signatures on the cash advance slips didn't match mine, that the IP address for the online transfers traced back to Karen's apartment, and that they were referring the case for prosecution. Jennifer called me and said Karen had just made my repayment case 10 times easier, because now it wasn't just about child support fraud, it was about financial fraud, forgery, and theft. The final hearing was scheduled for mid-December, and by that point Karen's world was falling apart in real time. She'd lost her part-time job after the fraud investigation became public, Greg's wife had filed for divorce after finding out about Timmy, and the legal system was now pursuing Greg for child support, while simultaneously investigating Karen for multiple counts of fraud. I showed up to court with Jennifer, and Karen showed up with a public defender because her original lawyer had dropped her, and she looked completely different from the confident woman who'd demanded more money just 7 months earlier. Judge Hayes reviewed everything: the original paternity fraud, the account theft, the forged documents, and the pattern of deception that had gone on for nearly a decade. And when Karen's public defender tried to argue that she'd been acting out of desperation as a single mother, Judge Hayes cut him off and said desperation doesn't justify fraud. The ruling came down hard. Karen was ordered to repay $60,000 in child support I'd paid over 9 years. She was placed on probation for the financial fraud, and she lost primary custody of Timmy pending a full evaluation. The judge said that Timmy would be placed temporarily with Karen's parents under court supervision while custody arrangements between Karen and Greg were being determined, and that I would have the option to pursue visitation if I wanted to maintain a relationship with the child I'd raised. I sat there listening to all of this and felt nothing, no satisfaction, no victory, just this overwhelming exhaustion that comes from watching something you built get demolished piece by piece. Karen looked at me as they read the custody decision, and her face was blank, like she'd finally run out of performances, and I wondered if she'd ever actually cared about Timmy or if he'd just been a paycheck to her all along. I walked out of that courthouse in mid-December with the winter air biting at my face, and Jennifer told me the repayment would probably take years, that Karen would likely declare bankruptcy, that I'd probably never see most of that money, but that at least the truth was finally on record. I thanked her, paid her final invoice, and drove home to my one-bedroom apartment where I'd been living like a broke college student for 9 years while funding someone else's lie. That night I sat on my couch and thought about Timmy, about whether I should pursue visitation, about whether it would hurt him more or help him to have me in his life after everything that had happened, and I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't destroy my son's life. I stopped letting a lie fund itself, and if that makes me a monster in some people's eyes, I can live with that. Timmy is in therapy now. Greg is trying to figure out how to be a father to a 9-year-old he didn't know existed, and Karen is living with her parents while she deals with probation and bankruptcy. I loved a child who wasn't mine by blood. I showed up for him when I thought he was mine, and I did everything a father is supposed to do. What broke everything wasn't the DNA. It was the moment she demanded more money and thought the truth wouldn't matter. This case reveals a fundamental truth about deception. It's never just one lie. It's a cascading system that requires constant maintenance and escalating risks. Karen's initial fraud might have remained hidden indefinitely if she hadn't gotten greedy. The real tragedy here isn't the legal outcome. It's that a child's entire foundation was built on dishonesty. The takeaway is clear. Short-term convenience through deception always carries long-term consequences that affect far more people than just the deceiver. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments. Drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.